5 things to know about Custer and his last stand. 1. Custer did not hate Indians. Custer's own words in his book My Life on the Plains debunks this myth. Custer had no compunction about warring on the Indians any more than he had on warring on rebellious Southerners in the Civil War. He had moral certainty in both cases. Custer writes, "Stripped of the beautiful romance with which we have been so long willing to envelop him, the Indian forfeits his claim to the appellation of the noble red man. We see him as he is one whose cruel and ferocious nature far exceeds that of any beast of the desert." Custer respected the Indian as an opponent. "I had an opportunity to witness the Indian mode of fighting in all its perfection. Surely no race of men, not even the famous Cossacks, could display more wonderful skill in feats of horsemanship than the Indian warrior on his native plains, mounted on his well-trained war pony." 2. In 1876, Custer was not the greatest Indian fighter in the West. By 1876, it was not Custer who was regarded as the greatest Indian fighter in the West, but Brigadier General George Crook. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick writes, "George Custer might fancy himself America's premier Indian fighter, but it was George Crook who had achieved the actual results." Philbrick writes, "Crook had spent the years in the Southwest hunting the Apache. He'd been so successful that it had been Crook, not Custer, who'd been elevated 2 grades from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. Crook left the likes of George Armstrong Custer in the dust." 3. The 7th Cavalry was not an elite regiment. Historian James Donovan details some of the glaring inadequacies of the 7th Cavalry as a fighting force. The frontier army was small, ill-trained and badly equipped by a miserly Congress. The quality of the troops was appalling. Only the malingerers, the bounty jumpers, the draft sneaks and the worthless remained in the army after the Civil War. Training in marksmanship, horsemanship, skirmishing, any practical lessons that Indian fighting might actually involve, was virtually non-existent. Formal military training of recruits consisted mostly of elementary drill aimed at making a grand appearance at dress parade. Custer overestimated the offensive capabilities of the 7th Cavalry. 4. Although brave to the point of recklessness, Custer was sloppy when it came to reconnaissance and logistics. On the night of June 24, Custer was at least 30 miles from the enemy, yet he turned sharply off the route prescribed by General Terry. No skilled Indian fighter would have attempted a noisy, blundering advance through darkness toward a foe whose exact position he did not know. If the Indians he followed had scouts within earshot, they must have had ample warning of his approach. Despite the fact that the regiment marched in several columns, the dust kicked up by the horses rose in enormous clouds which were visible for miles. The Indians knew the location of the regiment from the smoke ascending from Custer's campfires, about 10 miles off, smoke which made Custer's Crow scouts very angry and caused them to question the judgment of the white leaders who seemed to operate under the principle that the Sioux were blind. Custer then divided his inferior command into 4 fractions. Custer confided no complete plan of battle to his officers. He made no arrangement for communication between the scattered subdivisions. When committed to conflict, Custer had less than half his outnumbered force under his control and only a vague idea where the remaining 7 troops were. Custer may have determined to strike the Sioux on their left flank while Reno assailed them from the front. Custer had no detailed map. The bluffs on the Little Bighorn's right bank deny horsemen easy access to the river. This discovery may have come belatedly to Custer, forcing him farther and farther north, seeking a crossing and finding extinction. Of Custer's flawed logistics, William Graham writes, "The pack train, which with its escort accounted for 130 men, more than 20% of the regiment, and which had in charge all the reserve ammunition, had been left far back on the trail, to struggle along the best it might. The men of the other 3 battalions carried only 100 rounds apiece of carbine ammunition, and 4 loadings, or 24 rounds, for their pistols. When the fight in the valley began, therefore, not one of the 3 fighting battalions had ammunition sufficient for prolonged combat, nor was within communicating distance of the reserve supply. Nor was any one of the 4 detachments of the regiment within supporting distance of either of the others." 5. Why Custer wasn't scalped. Evan S. Connell offers an explanation in his book, Son of the Morning Star. Connell writes, "For a long time many Americans thought Custer had earned this respect by his courage, But this appears to be no more than a white man's tale. Many Indians were consulted and their answers noted. From a warrior's point of view, the son of the morning star had an unattractive head. The hair was sparse because he was growing prematurely bald and what remained had been cut short. A number of braves might have inspected him and decided the hair was not worth keeping.